We're almost right on time, which for an architecture school is great. I'm Jonathan Solomon. I'm the Associate Dean of the School of Architecture. And before I introduce tonight's guest, I'd like to remind anyone who's joining us from outside the community that there is a near weekly lecture series run out of the school in this room Tuesday nights at 5 p.m. There are very large posters in the two stair cores detailing the schedule, and I encourage you to continue to attend. It's always a pleasure to introduce friends, and in the case of tonight's speaker, who's joining us from Berkeley, California, Nicholas de Monchaux, fellow travelers. In fact, Nicholas and I have only met a few times, but I've grown close to him over the last couple of years by reputation. Our friendship developed, as it were, in the space between places, as Nicholas might quote Gordon Matta Clark. For example, in 2007, I was having lunch with Kevin Lippert, a friend and the publisher of Princeton Architectural Press, and I was revealing at the time my apprehension at the approaching birth of my first child. How would I manage the pressures of working as a young architect and teacher with this new burden of fatherhood? And he looked across the table and asked me, "Do you know Nicholas de Monchaux?" It turns out he was going through the same thing at the same time, and of course is a model for success in both areas. Nicholas and I both attended the master's program at the School of Architecture at Princeton University, and while we did not overlap during our time there, I was a classmate of his twin brother, Thomas. Anyone who's familiar with the student body at Princeton knows of the school's penchant for twin siblings. Discussion of Thomas, a mythical figure in his own right, but that's a story for another lecture, would invariably come around to this condition. Do you know he has a twin brother? He's working on a book on the Spacesuit. That book, and its story, is emblematic of the best things about architecture schools and of Nicholas's own realm of special contributions to the discipline. I have this copy here, Spacesuit, Fashioning Apollo, published by the MIT Press in 2011, 13 years after its origins, in a research paper for a seminar taught by Georges Teyssot in 1998. That paper was revived, in the author's words, by an invitation to present at the Thomas Jefferson Society of Architectural Historians in 2002, and a residency at the Santa Fe Institute in 2003. Grants and fellowships from the Graham Foundation for Advanced Study in the Fine Arts and the National Air and Space Museum further supported Nicholas's research. Spacesuit is an exemplary microhistory. It's an intensive investigation of a single object that elucidates the themes of the historical period encompassing it. With an emphasis on the personal experiences and physical objects that surround the design, fabrication, and deployment of the spacesuit, we hear about the bruising and blurred vision suffered by Major John P. Stapp while testing the effects of rapid acceleration and deceleration on the human body, in this case his own, and about Big Mo and Sweet Sue, the two Singer sewing machines used to fabricate the suit itself, and the women who worked them, such as Hazel Fellows and Julia Avery. But the book is also a Cold War chronicle of sorts, revealing, I believe, its origins in the culture of Princeton in the late 90s, fashion, politics, domesticity, cyborgs, surveillance. Spacesuit could only come from the diverse and perverse transdisciplinary purview of an architecture school, where ideas and objects alike are subjected, like Major Stapp, to intense and bruising analysis from every possible angle. Spacesuit is an affirmation of the broad relevance and value of architectural scholarship. It has received accolades from Adam Gopnik in The New Yorker, from the Los Angeles Times Review of Books, from The Atlantic, Icon, and other publications. The achievement of Spacesuit is all the more remarkable when seen beside Nicholas's parallel career as director of an Oakland, California-based design practice. His recent project, Local Code Real Estates, uses geospatial analysis to identify thousands of publicly owned, abandoned sites in major US cities, imagining this distributed vacant landscape as a new urban system. Using parametric design tools, a landscape proposal for each site is tailored to local conditions, optimizing thermal and hydrological performance to enhance the whole city's ecology. Local codes' quantifiable effects on energy usage and stormwater remediation suggest alternatives to the need for more expensive sewer and electrical upgrades. Where Spacesuit worked from the object out, local code is based on an understanding of the role of locally optimized landscapes within a network of urban places and virtual spaces. This ability to see both the local and the global simultaneously is what sets Nicholas's careful gaze apart. It is a way of looking that reveals exceptional value in the everyday, and new possibilities in the tired or discarded, and new depth in things that, surrounding us, we thought we had already figured out. Nicholas de Monchaux is Assistant Professor of Architecture and Urban Design at the University of California, Berkeley, where he serves on the Executive Committee of the Berkeley Center for New Media. He received his BA with distinction in architecture from Yale University and his MArch from Princeton. Before his academic career, he worked as a designer for Michael Hopkins and Partners in London and Diller Scofidio and Renfro in New York. A prolific author and designer, Nicholas's work has been published and reviewed in Log, Architectural Design, the New York Times, and the Wall Street Journal, and exhibited at the 2010 Biennial of the Americas, the San Jose 01 Biennial, and SF MoMA, as well as the US Pavillion at the 13th Venice Architectural Biennale. He has received design awards and citations from the International Union of Architects, Pamphlet Architecture, and the Van Allen Institute, who awarded him the 2000 John Dinkeloo Memorial Fellowship at the American Academy in Rome. Please join me in welcoming Nicholas to Syracuse. I'm off, you're on. You're welcome. Welcome.
Well, I can say with great certainty that, Jonathan, you're too kind. That guy sounds very interesting. I'm not sure if he's quite who showed up here this evening, but when I was an architecture student a whole decade ago, it was at a moment of transition in architectural media and also transition in architectural culture. Jonathan and I were both students at a very theoretically engaged architecture school, and the lectures we got went something like this. A series of slides, slide transparencies projected by the shining of a light through a photographic emulsion, and usually they would be about 15 or 20 minutes of Foucault or Deleuze or one of the usual suspects, French philosophers, and then some architectural work that followed it. I haven't been the only one to notice a real shift in the culture of this event, the architectural lecture, which is a very important event in the life of the profession and the life of architecture schools. Today's lectures, more often than not, look something like this, which is to say a whole bunch of architectural projects. More often than not, the lecturer will be, changing things around the last minute, and the first view you'll have of the lecture will be this kind of software interface to a huge quantity of information that gets just thrown at you again and again and again. And I'll talk tonight about that, about what the rather startling shift in the amount and availability of information in the world means for this practice, not just for the medium of the architectural lecture, but for the medium of architectural practice as well. But the lecture I'm going to give you tonight is an attempt to do something slightly different. It's a little bit retro, a little bit, I hope, futuristic, and that is that it's an attempt to show you some of my own design work, which comes, as I said, from attempting to really deeply consider these questions of media and interface and how they relate to architectural practice, and also to consider what some relevant theoretical and ideological background to those ideas might be. Because I believe, as an architect, first and foremost, that ideas and software and media are all tools that we need to use to continue to shape our practice to meet a rapidly changing world. Let me talk a little bit first about that changing world and why we might want to deeply consider these questions about not just technology, media, interface, and theory, but also ecologies and human landscapes. As is, I hope, news to no one. As I hope this is not news to anyone in this room, but our world is changing. Our world is changing very rapidly, not least the anthropogenic climate change, which is an established scientific fact, is going to lead within the next half century or century to not just, not the least important effects of climate change are the kind of steadily climbing statistics in these graphs, and the most important effect of climate change is this much fainter but more erratic red line. That is to say, with shifts in climate become far greater instabilities in climate, far greater challenges in terms of weather and ecology to human settlements in the, on the face of the earth. At the same time, of course, I hope this is also not news to anyone, human settlements are themselves rapidly changing. We will build in the next 40 years as much urban fabric as we have in the previous 10,000 years of human history. 10,000 years, 40 years. Not only that, but this urban fabric will mostly happen in parts of the world and be constructed in ways which our profession has traditionally not necessarily grappled with or engaged. Informal settlements, the global south, as it's now called, and it will happen in ways where traditional notions of infrastructure, transportation, even civic and public space are not necessarily as applicable as we might want them to be. The last fundamental change that I believe we need to grapple with as a profession is, of course, the change in the very tools we can use to perceive all these other changes. That is to say, in the fabric of our information landscape itself. We, if you're ready, one last statistic before I finish. We produce as much data now as a civilization, global civilization, in 36 hours as we did from the dawn of human history until 2003. Which is to say that the amount of information we have at our disposal is so rapidly changing that we have changed within the last decade from a condition as architects where it was previously very difficult to find the right kind of information about the right kinds of sites or situations we wanted to engage, to a moment no doubt familiar to all of you, where we have suddenly way too much information, and yet somehow also never quite the information that we need. Finally, the information that we have is going from this kind of, this was a very popular image 5 or 10 years ago, a kind of disembodied vision of the internet as a kind of network, to this condition. This is the work of a San Francisco-based programmer named Eric Schmidt, who studies Twitter handles and Flickr IDs and traces them and spatializes them. The data we have all around us is increasingly and profoundly becoming spatialized, and therefore, whether we like it or not, entering the purview of this profession, this discipline, and this school. Now, stepping back from this, all of these changes are one of the most profound effects, I believe, of these shifts, or one of the most profound changes should be in our mindset as architects, is to think less about our creations as static, timeless edifices, as has traditionally been the want, especially in architectural education, and think at a deeper level about something very different, which is the idea of time, the idea of entropy, the idea of change as it occurs. This is a short section of a very wonderful film by the Swiss artist Peter Verschilly and David Weiss called Der Lauf der Linge, or The Way Things Go. And entropy is one of the most fundamental forces, of course, any of our buildings face, and yet it is one which we are often least inclined to grapple with or face as architects. Entropy in physical space, as depicted here, is often assumed to be a kind of flattening or cooling or attenuation of objects and things into ashes or dust, or the kinds of invisible, uniform traces of a prior order. Interestingly enough, entropy in an informational space, and in my lecture tonight I'm going to repeatedly grapple with the intersection of information space, the space of information and the space of cities. Entropy in an informational space represents something very different. Instead of the kind of flattening or slow attenuation into uniformity, entropy in information takes the form of static. What you're actually looking here, TV static, which is a kind of unknown in the age of digital television, is actually the cosmic background radiation, which is one of the only truly random sources of information we have, so much so that most state lotteries and national lotteries actually subscribe to a service which monitors the cosmic background radiation in order to provide the seed of the random numbers that create the lottery. Otherwise, if we attempt to use a kind of man-made structure to produce the same random numbers, inevitably the ghost in the machine will out and the numbers will have some kind of order. Now, that's a lot for the first 5 minutes of a lecture, but what I'm here to talk to you about today is a design project of mine of the last 3 years that I've done in collaboration with many others, which is an attempt to think deeply and, more importantly, instrumentally about how information can change, not only allow us to do what we've always done better, that is to say, to improve existing models of architectural and urban practice, but how the widespread increasing availability of information about urban space can also open up new and potentially important new kinds of architectural and design practice that were previously might not have been possible at all, but which may, I believe, be instrumental in negotiating this enormous urban ecological transition that we now face as a global civilization. But one of the first inspirations for this project was an artwork by Gordon Matta-Clark, who between 1971 and 1973 spent enormous numbers of hours sifting through microfiche in the property records of the city of New York to discover 15 vacant or abandoned sites, which he then gained title to. Nowadays, with a GIS search, or a geographic information system, we can find about 5,000 of these sites in a few minutes. And so at the most fundamental level, the project is about what to do with these sites once we've found them, and what to do with these new kinds of information once we've thought about them. If you'll let me go on another kind of historical digression for a moment, all the way back to 1864, when Charles Babbage, who invented, in many ways, modern computing, recounted that, quote, "On several occasions I have been asked, 'Pray, Mr. Babbage, if you put into the machine wrong figures, will the right answers come out?' Which is to say that we have a tendency to assume that any result out of a calculated process, that any digitally inflected outcome is inherently correct because of the certainty with which a calculating machine gives you a 1 or a 0 or a yes or a no. This is not necessarily always the case. The kind of acronymic efficiency of 20th century computer engineering has reduced this principle to a single acronym, which is GIGO, or garbage in, garbage out. That is to say, any data-driven process is only good as the data you feed into it. This reflection is particularly interesting, I think, in the light of contemporary architectural practice, where we don't see quite the same breathlessness about parametrically driven design as we did maybe 3 or 4 years ago, but nevertheless, there's a kind of certitude and a certainty to a lot of formally driven outcomes of data-driven processes, which masks, I believe, a kind of missed opportunity of deep reflection about what kinds of data we might choose to put into a data-driven design process, and what new kinds of opportunities thinking critically about the data that goes into a digital design process might actually give us. Now, the kinds of data and data-driven design processes that I'm going to talk about tonight actually themselves have a really interesting history. The electronic map projection, and indeed much of as we will see, the enterprise of spatial computing has its direct origin in the Cold War, in the invention of systems like this one, the semi-autonomous ground environment, or SAGE, which was a defense engineering system in the late 1940s and early 1950s, which involved the very first computer memory, or RAM, and also the very first graphical spatial interface seen here in the console, that was deemed to be designed to be so symbiotic with its user that it actually also had an automotive cigarette lighter just right there by his hand. The larger enterprise of systems engineering, as it came to be called, that this defense system was a part of, was invented by mostly invented by these three guys in the course of the invention and design of America's first intercontinental ballistic missiles between about 1952 and 1957. Simon Ramo and Dean Wooldridge were the founders of what would become the giant defense contractor TRW, but this guy is especially interesting, Bernard Shriver. He was actually an architect first, and then the Depression drove him into the Air Force, where he, after the Second World War, became convinced that traditional ways of producing prototype objects, airplanes, weapon systems, were inadequate to face the enormously complex task of making these intercontinental ballistic missiles. And he conceived of an idea of what would become to be called systems engineering, of designing not objects, but relationships between objects based on information. That is as ubiquitous today as it was completely novel at the time. In fact, when he used the word system the very first time in a report to the chiefs of staff, the word system was so uncommon in everyday English usage that the report had to give several pages to a definition of what a system was. It gave examples like the solar system or a train system, et cetera, et cetera. And so if you think about for a second how many systems you've touched today, systems and systems within systems, and then imagine a world where none of these things existed, and even the idea of these kinds of relationships between systems and networks was as uncommon as it is now. One interesting result of this, as well as the modern military-industrial complex, was a sense of enormous optimism about what systems and computers could accomplish. This kind of optimism led US Vice President Hubert Humphrey to remark at the Smithsonian in 1968 that, quote, "The techniques that are going to put a man on the moon are going to be exactly the same techniques that we are going to need to clean up American cities." Humphrey pointed especially to the systems analysis approach. Now, this was not a comparison of difficulty. This was not a, if we can go to the moon or if we can build a missile, surely we can solve the problems of American cities. This was precisely a statement of the application of expertise from one arena, in this case military-industrial systems building, to another arena where it was imagined that these techniques would be particularly useful. This sense of co-opting technology from aerospace and the nascent kind of systems computing industries into the problems of urban design was consummated with a series of summer schools and conferences between HUD, which is a brand new department of the federal government, and NASA, conferences like this one, and it resulted in some amazing transfers. This, but one small example, is a spaceship, a nuclear-propelled spaceship invented by a guy named Harold Finger at NASA. It incidentally was used by Stanley Kubrick as the model for the spaceship Discovery in the movie 2001. By 1970, Harold Finger went from being director of nuclear propulsion research for NASA to director of research and technology for HUD, where he supervised the invention of as far as I've been able to determine, was the very first parametric design software, which was an automated site planning tool constructed for a housing program called Operation Breakthrough that Finger supervised at HUD between 1969 and 1972. It also, for instance, resulted in this. The very first architectural rendering made and even navigated using the lunar landing simulator developed for the Apollo program by the architecture program at UCLA, and depicting a kind of modernist proposal for downtown Los Angeles that was restricted to only 256 edges worth of geometry, but turns out they were in luck because that's all you need for a modernist cityscape. Now, what happened to these programs is really interesting in historical terms. That giant program I mentioned, Operation Breakthrough, that happened at HUD using space technology was actually cited by the General Accounting Office for its total lack of impact on the American building professions. And indeed, the elaborate systems-designed architectural prototypes, including that parametric site design software, in the end were used most extensively, I kid you not, for this proposal for a 10,000 person space station halfway between the moon and the Earth, designed by NASA's Ames Research Center in 1972, in which these housing prototypes were judged to be perfectly suited to this environment that would contain 10,000 astronauts optimized by age and gender and, quote, settled by persons from Western industrialized nations, governed by, quote, principles from government and industry, which is, of course, the perfect kind of utopia, a non-place where everything works, far away from where we are now, both literally and conceptually. And this idea of a kind of total informationally inflected landscape, the reduction or extension of architecture to an automatic, cybernetic, dare we say, parametric response to the environment, recalls contemporaneous collages by Superstudio, and it also leaves us with an idea of architecture that's everywhere and also nowhere. Like any modernist dream, it's transparent, but in this case, the transparency is not just of physical or even phenomenological experience, but it's a transparency of control. This is the illusion that systems-based technology, born in this in the crucible of the Cold War, gives us even to this day, even on our architectural desktops. Now, this is, of course, an image from Colin Rowe's Mathematics of the Ideal Villa, my tribute to upstate New York. I find it really fascinating that even now, half a century later, when geospatial data is really changing how we interact with place, and it's also true that a range of forces, including the rift between architecture and planning, that's one of the main legacies of system planning's urban failure, the separation of architecture and planning schools around the country was exactly contemporary with this 1970s, the failure of these informationally based planning models. It's very interesting that the recent moves towards digitally based design, whether BIM or parametrically based, have almost entirely avoided information about place. That is to say, geospatial data that has an actual location in the world, is almost totally absent from a lot of the formally driven work that I was showing you earlier. This is especially interesting if you go into the history as well, because if we go back to Gordon Matta-Clark, Gordon Matta-Clark was, of course, a student of architecture at Cornell from 1962 to 1968, and the formally driven methodologies, which I'm not the first one to point out, lead directly into a lot of today's digital architectural discourse, were ultimately held by him in violent disregard, most famously when he destroyed the windows of Peter Eisenman's Institute for Architecture and Urban Studies in New York with an air rifle. The violence of the act, at least for Matta-Clark, was a deliberate attempt to recall the abandoned, shard-shrouded interiors of New York's great modernist housing projects, which were by the 1970s far more abandoned and blighted than they are today. And the interest that Matta-Clark had even then in these abandoned spaces, in which some of the first cuts and splits and architectural inventions that he would later become famous for took place, brings us back to what I started with and to my own attempts to show you and imagine with you how a kind of geospatially inflected data architecture might open up crucial new possibilities, particularly around the notion, the ability of information to highlight and allow us to examine that which the city neglects, discards, or sets aside. So if we go back to the to our ability today to find these 4,000 sites, we can also say with great certainty that New York City is not unique in this regard at all. If we look at any major American city, we find hundreds, sometimes even thousands of acres of vacant publicly owned land. In this case, it's Boston, New Orleans, Miami, and San Francisco. The case study that I'm going to show, spend most of the time showing you this evening is a study of San Francisco, and particularly of these 1,800 sites throughout the city that are called by the city unaccepted streets. Often they are zoned or built as right-of-ways, but they're not owned by the city, and they're not maintained by it either. I got this data set as an Excel spreadsheet of all the sites that the Department of Public Works in San Francisco said that they wouldn't deal with, or wouldn't maintain, or even if there was a burning couch on it, they wouldn't come and do anything about it. So these sites, what Matt and Clark called spaces between places, become particularly interesting when you overlay other kinds of geospatial data. If you, for example, take the sites in black, you can overlay respiratory hazards, carcinogen quotients, reported crime, and you see, maybe not surprisingly, an almost one-to-one overlap between a whole range of symptoms of urban decline and neglect and the availability of these spaces. Ecological data makes the picture even more interesting. These are heat islands in San Francisco. Here we have impedances in the city's stormwater system. They all respiratory, particulate matter and carcinogens in the air. And most of what the proposal that I'll show you tonight attempts to do is to take these sites together and turn them into a kind of land-banked renovation, a temporary but instrumental renovation that might allow us to consider or imagine a new kind of urban network. So this is a kind of simulation of what the software and this parametric process actually does, which is take each one of these sites, do a series of highly localized ecological analyses of things like insulation, drainage, the presence of proximity of heat islands, and then performs, works out what the best proportion of surfaces is to do ecological work precisely on this spot, and then distributes them according to geometry which is derived empirically from the kind of local lot geometry and individual situation on the city. The most important part of this is the in many ways is money, and the renovation that we proposed for each of these 1,800 sites is doesn't take place. It is a kind of paper architecture, but it takes place in a world where we do have to worry about things like how to pay for it. And in fact, what we've shown with a series of GIS analysis is if you take a series of existing funds, including existing infrastructural funds, if you even take, let's say, half of them, and then spend that money in proportion on all these sites, in proportion to the work that each one of these sites can actually do, then not only do you get the same result than if you'd spent twice as much money on more traditional infrastructure, but you do it at the cost of about $600 a square foot, precisely in those parts of the city that aren't getting any other kind of actual investment. If you look at these individual design proposals for a moment, what you'll see is that the design proposals, of course, shift. This is the digital, the kind of parametric output of the design process. But in many ways, the most important part of these images is over here, and this is the proportion of proposed surfaces that will accomplish the kind of best ecological outcome for each site locally. And then even more importantly is the proportion of funds, or which is to say the actual amount of work we can claim that each site is doing based, and thus the parcels of existing government money that we can potentially lay claim to do the work. So just to make it totally clear, I'll take you through the entire process again. It's a process that goes from site identification to citywide analysis to a site-specific analysis. This is the software doing that work on each site, to the kind of highly localized inputs and outputs of each site proposal, and then the least developed, but I recognize one of the most important parts of the site is a kind of potential framework for community engagement, also using digital media that we're in the process of developing with the Berkeley Center for New Media on campus. Now, this is probably the geekiest slide of all, but what the actual work that we've done is actually not that enormous. All we've actually done to allow this parametric process to take place is to, instead of operating under a kind of, is write a small piece of software which basically sits between, of open source software that sits between any kind of GIS data you have and any parametric modeler that can understand the Python programming language, which is anything from Rhino to Maya to 3D Studio, et cetera, and basically connect information about place to the way in which information is handled within a parametric or BIM environment, and then not only that, but hand information back. So once we've made a design proposal, we can model not just its individual geometry, but also the effect of all the design proposals on the overall urban ecology and go back and forth. And it's this kind of, I think, instrumental thinking about the flow of information in a design process, which is probably the most important point I'm trying to make to you tonight, is to think, encourage you as students and as architects to think critically about the role of information in a design process, to understand that the machine in front of you is fundamentally designed to handle information. That's what it's very, very good at. It's very bad at everything else. But that you need to think, therefore think really critically and instrumentally about the kind of information you choose to hand it and what you do with it. So I think the other point I would make at a larger urban scale, and this is of course this completed design proposal here in the ensuing celebrations. But what you'll see in a minute is all of the proposals for this case study in San Francisco considered not just as individual design outcomes, but this is the important part of circling back around and realizing that what they also have the potential to be is a network. And there's been a lot of great work done on the role of pedestrian, ecological, and habitat networks in cities and how instrumentally important these networks are to overall urban health and then to what we might call urban robustness and urban resilience, which is to say the ability of a city to bounce back from whether it's a weather event or other kind of catastrophe, and not only that, but adapt to new and shifting urban circumstances. Now, am I moving too fast? Okay. So that's all great, but I would be lying if I told you that this doesn't kind of resonate even with me, even for me, with the kind of over-optimistic, kind of enthusiastic, but ultimately deeply flawed logics with which systems, information systems were first applied to urban problems in the 1960s and 1970s. And in fact, there are many, many important caveats to such information-based processes. Not that we shouldn't do them, I believe we urgently should, but we really need to be conscious of the background problem and hazards that an information-based lens brings especially when it comes to the city. And this is what I'll spend the rest of my time this evening talking to you about, or trying to elaborate more clearly. Interestingly enough, let's see. Matta Clark's own career actually contained really interesting seeds of these kinds of caveats and warnings. Central to Matta Clark's view of urban design was the experience of his father, Robert Matta, who had worked for 2 years in the studio of Le Corbusier before rejecting the master's work as being suitable only for a presumably non-existent creature that lived in perfect harmony with society and work. Matta Clark traced his own interest in adaptive reuse to the observation that, quote, the availability of empty and neglected structures is a prime textual reminder of the ongoing fallacy of renewal through modernization. Rosalind Krauss begins her 1996 essay collaboration with Yves Alembois called A User's Guide to Entropy, with a thermodynamic consideration that parallels the kind of engagement with physics with which my lecture tonight began. In particular, Krauss cites Robert Caillois' description of a quote, hot and cold water mixing together to settle into uniform tepid blandness, as well as Robert Smithson's own fluid image of a boy running in circles in a sandbox, mixing black and white grains in an ever grayer, quote, movement towards uniformity. Later in the text, several sections contributed by Bois consider the work of Madeclark as being exemplary of what he calls, quote, entropic practice. By ordering Madeclark's work's collective disorder in successive scales, Bois first considers the artist's experiments in molding, layering, and burning physical objects, such as the scorched gold leaf Polaroid prints of the fried photographs. He then moves on to Madeclark's cutting and dismembering of buildings and concludes with an extended consideration of fake estates. Bois consistently emphasizes the, quote, sovereign contempt in Madeclark's attitude towards architects. Bois even adopts Madeclark's voice for the purpose. Quote, what I do you could never achieve, since that presupposes accepting ephemerality. Architecture has only one destiny, and that is, sooner or later, to go down the chute. Now, earlier in the lecture, I deployed Madeclark's singular derision for the realm of autonomous formalism in design. It seems today an easy, if violent, contrast. Yet, even more interestingly, back in 1994, when A User's Guide to Entropy was being written, this point, the point of kind of disagreement and disaffection between Madeclark and formalism, was not just academic. Beyond the social history connecting 1970s formalism to contemporary practice, or even the family resemblance between the whiteness of the whites and the whiteness of today's parametric practice, there's also the family tree to consider. And the branch between these generations is what was called at the time deconstruction, the particular formalist turn of the 1990s, whose attempts to appropriate the works of Madeclark are what Bois' essay was most deliberately trying to address. To no clear effect, incidentally, as recently as Perspective 35 in 2004 in the essay Index to Codex, Peter Eisenman's trumpets Madeclark as a vital precedent to his own work, a conclusion with which I hope you see now Madeclark would violently disagree. Yet if we accept, I think rightly so, given the artist's own statement on the subject, quote, those are all the guys I hate, Bois's assertion that Madeclark's creative destruction was anathema to its deconstructivist appropriation in the mid-1990s, we can actually find some tantalizing evidence of the architect's own interest in more alternative modes of constructive architectural practice, modes of practice that he was moving into and that were cut short by his early death. One of Madeclark's last unfinished works was the physical construction of a community center on an unused site in Manhattan's Lower East Side, for which he was preparing a proposal when he passed away in 1978. Madeclark described the audience for his community center proposal as precisely, quote, a network of community groups and individuals engaged in open space and rehab projects, sweat equity, community gardens, play lots, cultural events, alternative living structures, etc., adding that the proposal itself had acted as a network to, quote, bring these groups together. Now, the use of the word network is particularly interesting. At the same time as his design work engaged more and more with the real social fabric of cities, Madeclark also became intrigued by what at the time was the state-of-the-art in digital practice. For a nascent project combining urban pneumatic architecture into what he termed network enclosures, for which he imagined the fake estates themselves as a site, the artist wrote shortly before his death to both MIT and UCLA, requesting the use of what were in fact nascent GIS systems, mapping and visualization software, the likes of which I showed you earlier in this lecture, declaring that the use of computers was destined to become, quote, an instrumental part of my search to chart and reoccupy space. Unfortunately, his proposals were, entreaties were rejected by both institutions, but I think it's particularly interesting in the light of the fact that a lot of contemporary digital language adopts easily the vocabulary of networks, and particularly that of complex non-hierarchical systems, words like emergence, complexity, morphogenesis, et cetera, et cetera. And I think at this point it's really important to remember that one of the earliest critics to connect these kinds of biological theories of emergence and complexity with urban design was, like Meta Clark, a student of mid-century Manhattan. When in the last chapter of her 1961 opus, The Death of Life of Great American Cities, itself called The Kind of Problem a City Is, Jane Jacobs seeks to articulate a metaphor for urban planning distinct from the, quote, collection of file drawers she abhorred. She turned to recent work at the Rockefeller Foundation, who had given her an office to write the book in, and also given her an office mate, Dr. Warren Weaver, who had specifically identified new thinking in the natural sciences, describing what he was the first to call organized complexity in the Rockefeller Foundation's 1958 report. Quoting directly from this report, Jacobs, in this chapter I'm talking about, makes a case for the special affinity between urban landscapes and biological systems. Invoking the example of a single urban park, she submits that any attempt to isolate the many variables leading to its success or failure, however numerous they may be, is inherently dubious, for such variables are too numerous, too complex, and too interconnected to be easily resolved. Now, since the 1960s, the Rockefeller Foundation's funding played a catalytic role in what are today's ubiquitous interdisciplinary discussions of emergent phenomena, and in particular, even leading to its adoption here in our own discipline. But a lot of today's architectural discourse around biomimetics and biological systems, I think, falls too easily in a kind of one-to-one between, let's say, the DNA, the way in which DNA codes for a specific physical property, and the way in which we might get a parametric system to code for a specific formal outcome. It's just not that simple. And indeed, recent work in evolutionary biology itself has underlined a new understanding of the relationship between code and form, which, far from occurring in the kind of predestined or one-to-one way that we might like to believe, that we might to imagine, as it were, DNA is the blueprint of life. In fact, much more like the life of that blueprint on a building site, the real relationships between code and form in nature, as it might also be said in the city, are too numerous, too interconnected, and as Jane Jacobs herself said of that park, quote, as slippery as an eel. By the way, as slides for this last kind of polemic, I'm showing you, first of all, some gallery-based installations that we did based on the work, most recently at SF MoMA, and here a project that we're in the middle of with a nonprofit in LA looking at the physical sites underneath billboards. Big billboard companies like Clear Channel and CBS buy land along the LA freeways to put billboards on. But because the freeways were all built over rivers to begin with, this land is actually very well suited to stormwater retention and remediation, and is also vacant in communities that have no parks. So we've been working with them to design a system of 700 parks for a set of these sites, which we were the first to map and discover. And that's the images I'm showing you. But I think the kind of theoretical context, which is this larger discourse about nature and morphogenesis and biomimicry, I think it's really important to remember in this context an observation that I first found in a book by Adrian Forty, which is to say that the consistent application of natural language or even biological language to architecture is more often than not a clear indication of the divorce between that building and that system and the actual messy, complicated realities of nature or biology. And I think these kinds of metaphors tend to, especially the metaphor of the building itself as a kind of organism or something that is coded for by a kind of DNA, tends more than letting nature or biology into an architectural process. It tends instead to do the reverse. That is to say, to buttress what is really one of the biggest enduring fallacies of our profession, which is that of the building as an independent object versus merely a kind of ephemeral fragment of a much larger system, cities and ecologies being chief amongst these larger systems to which our buildings are inevitably and inexorably connected. However, before I get too down on architects, I think the reverse is also really interestingly the case. That is to say, the consistent biology, it turns out, and evolutionary biology in particular, is the home of a consistent application of architectural metaphors to the workings of nature. Such terms as foundations, building blocks, blueprints, and even the imposing German word Bauplan, or building plan, are some of the words that evolutionary biologists use most frequently to describe how the fundamental architecture of life. But in a kind of interesting inversion of the promiscuous application of biological words to architecture, the promiscuous application of architectural words to biology has tended to perpetuate an idealized, overtly deterministic vision of the operation of natural systems, of the design of natural systems, which have served ironically to mask the very same qualities in nature that are also inseparable from the reality of crafting buildings and landscapes. That is to say, chance, contingency, complexity, and luck. To those who began within his own lifetime to ascribe a kind of godlike power of optimization to the operations of natural selection during Darwin's lifetime, Darwin himself lamented, quote, "Great is the power of steady misinterpretation." That is to say, the world is a lot more complicated and rarely optimized, but always inevitably robust. It was with a real sense of irony then that the late evolutionary biologist Stephen Jay Gould deployed an architectural metaphor to attack the foundations of such design-centric evolutionary beliefs. In an important 1979 essay, Gould reasoned that under this then ubiquitous adaptionist viewpoint, the pendentives of San Marco, termed spandrels by Gould incorrectly, would be understood to be a perfect adaptation to the presentation of triangular paintings of angels. Instead, of course, they share with the urban islands of the work that I've showed you tonight an identity as a discovered and exploited leftover. The useful exploitation of spandrels, as such moments are now termed in biology, is now held to be responsible for such insignificant evolutionary achievements as feathers, the vertebrate skeleton, and human hearing. That is to say, none of them were originally intended for the purpose to which they were ultimately used. The bones inside our ear started out as the pieces of the reptilian jaw, which is why you can't eat anything larger than your head, but you can hear. The vertebrate skeleton started out as phosphate deposits in early invertebrates, later adopted and misappropriated for structural use, and feathers started out as an insulation mechanism and only led, quite incidentally, to the evolution of flight. And I think when we look at nature, and this is my problem with the larger discourse of biomimicry that I was talking about, the operation of precisely these kinds of, as they're called in biology, exaptations, deliberate misuses, reappropriations, using something, fashioning even something for a use it wasn't originally intended. This most important design process in nature is the one that we are least comfortable as architects kind of accepting or embracing. And yet I think has, as I hope I've shown in the design work tonight, some of the best potential to meet these rather serious challenges that we face as makers of cities and places. More, I think, especially relevant to our discipline, in the time since Gould wrote his essay in 1979, some of the most innovative work in evolutionary biology has focused on the enormous contribution of inaccuracy, inefficiency, and disarray to the very qualities of natural systems, their adaptiveness, robustness, and resilience that our current architectural moment is most in need of. So let me again just explain what I mean by that. It turns out that the disorder and the kind of unoptimal quality of natural systems is precisely the thing that leads to their robustness and resilience. Your immune system is very inefficient. No one would have ever designed it to work in the way it does because it misuses and misappropriates any number of things that were originally intended for other purposes, but it's precisely this quality, this inefficiency and disorder that leads to its enormous effectiveness. Recent studies of urban form, infrastructure, and even intellectual productivity have revealed uncanny parallels between biological systems and the robustness and morphology of urban systems. In such a context, the city is not, as was first proposed during the heyday of systems design, a, quote, information system to be manipulated by data, but rather a contingent, emergent, and adaptive system that will often thrive not as a result of our best design efforts, but quite often despite them. With its attempts at the catalytic and systematic processing of urban data, it is to this vision of the city that the work that I've shown you tonight aspires. And yet, in the light of this vision, even the local code itself of our proposals becomes much more like a real architectural blueprint versus our idealization of it. In nature, as in the city, such elegant text turns out to have only the most subtle and secondary effects on the way the world actually takes place. Thank you very much. I would love to. I think that lecture could have suffered both from density and disarray, so I'd be delighted to expand, explain, or do anything at all I could to clarify. Hi.
I'm going to go back to a point you were making right at the end.
Yeah.
Don't mean to make it a kind of gotcha of
Yeah.
anything, but you were talking about this interesting misuse of the spandrel.
Yeah.
And then the idea of disarray and misuse.
Yeah.
As somehow very generative,
Yeah.
I guess, potentially. I'm wondering where the line is between that and something else you were saying just a moment later about it provoking new systems.
Right.
So we're talking on the one hand about misuse and disarray,
Yeah.
and on the other hand using the word systems.
Right.
And how you apply
Yeah.
between those two.
I think I think that's the territory that's the territory that we need to explore through work more than necessarily through ideas, but I think ideas can really get us to interesting places within them. If I were to answer the question in terms of metaphor, I would say, for example, I would bring up there was a really interesting historical moment in the 1950s when glassware used in laboratories was first produced by machines instead of by the human hand. And it was discovered all kinds of experiments and industrial procedures started going wrong because of the absence of what were ultimately called, came to be called catalytic cracks. That is to say, microscopic faults within the surface of in this case, the vessel in which the reaction was taking place, without which in a perfect vessel, the reaction actually didn't take place at all, because it was precisely these kind of small disturbances to the perfect geometry that provided the framework for the very first reactions. That's a metaphorical answer, not a literal answer. I think in the actual landscape of a city, I mean, something like there are all kinds of examples as well. I mean, I worked a little bit on the beginnings of the High Line in New York, and that's a classic example of a kind of misappropriation that leads to a new urban system. One would wish that the High Line was more of a system. That is to say, one wished that it was A, more transferable, and B, better integrated into the larger network of the city versus a kind of special place of kind of display and appropriation. But it's the kind of it turns out another maybe interesting a kind of social versus a metaphorical answer is when I talk to a lot of the kind of theoretical part of this work has been developed I'm very fortunate to have a series of residencies at the Santa Fe Institute where people much smarter than I think about these kinds of things. But I can tell you that the urban phenomena that molecular biologists are most interested in is artists. Because it turns out in the workings, for example, of the human cell, there are all kinds of seemingly useless molecules and operators that go out to places that nothing's happening, and ready them for use by others, and then go somewhere else and then get muscled out once the places they make are appropriately kind of settled, and then do it. And I think anyone who is experienced in the workings of cities realizes that this is a real, this is that in fact the kind of reuse and misappropriation and kind of the making of social, cultural, and economic systems out of things which are secondary to a kind of the primary economy of the city is one of the things that keeps the city alive. One of the most important forces in keeping the city alive. And I'd much rather live in a city like Rio, which has too much informality, than a city which has too much of the reverse. Now, one of the really interesting things, though, that's happening in a lot of, I started, one of the many caveats that I try to give to this work when I show it is a real recognition that I start out talking about the huge expansion of global urbanization, but it's really crucial to recognize that most of that expansion will happen not using any form of design that you or I or anyone in this room would recognize as urban design, and yet I think it's precisely in that kind of environment where this kind of work I would hope would lead to a focus on the kinds of innovations that are happening in places like Rio, where there's been a really interesting movement away from a kind of removal of favelas and arrangement barrier towards a kind of, I hate to say kind of civilizing of them, but certainly an integration, a systems level integration of informal sewer systems with a real sewer system, informal electrical systems with the real electrical systems, et cetera, and a kind of recognition that the emergent phenomenon of cities can integrate with design, and especially with thinking about infrastructure. Because we can't afford, certainly that the amount of city we're going to build in the next 40 years, I said, is the same as we built in the last 10,000s. But interestingly enough, it'll cost twice as much in kind of adjusted dollars to build the second half of the global city as it has to take the first half. And so anything we can do to think about how that, and most of that spending is infrastructure, and is drainage, is flush toilets, is all this crazy stuff that is not going to work, of course, at that scale. And so anything we can do to think about how to make the infrastructure of the city match not our mental model of a kind of centralized efficiency, but rather the kind of dispersed, seemingly inefficient, but actually very robust model that a lot of the real landscape of cities actually shows us. That's very important design work, I think, in terms of how we're going to make a contribution to that larger urbanizing prospect. I don't know if any of that answers your question, but yeah.
I have a follow-up question. Using a metaphor, I feel like a racetrack and I'm a pedestrian who can barely drive a car. So if my question is very naive, I'll move forward very quickly. But to say that I was very impressed, inspired by many things you said. I completely find support to the idea of your critique of the certainty search, the one-to-one code-to-form relationship. I find that fantastic. But my question is sort of going back about method process, and maybe can escalate to a conceptual question. And it relates to your project in San Francisco.
Yeah.
The very focused way in which you look at abandoned places and use Monchaux, which is heavily political in its insertion, is something that I'm probably less pedestrian in that area, but I am in the themes. But I was interested in you saying data in and data out, and the abandoned places, dynamic that form them, that creates them, the people that intersect with them, are complex systems as well. But you choose to map in the design, and they use the parametric to natural system, ecology and so forth. So I'm interested, if you're addressing a political system, why are you measuring natural system as a response? And in a way, your community comes as some kind of element at the end. I'm not advocating. I'm not a community activist. But part of the question begins to be extrapolated is whether, if you walk back the aisle and we begin to talk about cities, a system where the metaphor takes over, because the natural systems are much easier to measure and therefore are more adaptable to the kind of system you're applying, as opposed to the much more unpredictable and complex system that is the social and the political. So I think it's both process and perhaps conceptual in the way that the tool is dictating the kind of reality, because in a way you started by saying how informational systems shape the way we perceive and act. So I'm beginning to question whether it's because certain things are easier to measure and to predict and are easy to argue for their effect in all this data, that we're actually constructing and sharpening the tools to look at those things.
No, I don't think that's a dumb question. I think that's probably one of the most important questions. And I think that there are two reasons why the work focused on kind of thermodynamics versus the sociality. Sociality is much more complicated. And in fact, if interestingly enough, this work was really came out of the same research, the same spacesuit research, and the kind of looking at the history of how computers have been used and misused in urban problems as to a kind of to model how we might better use them today. One of the real problems that organizations like the Community Analysis Bureau was a kind of systems unit within the LA government, or the RAND Institute in the New York City government, one of the enormous problems they ran into was their wild over-optimism about how social processes could be modeled. And the Community Analysis Bureau in LA came up with things like racial identification indices by which every census tract was rated and things like that, and this led to all kinds of, bad models and decisions. I think that I often find myself using this quote, which I'm sure I'm taking out of context, but in a transcript of the last SIAM meeting, there's a point where Christopher Alexander stands up and says, computers will never be useful in architecture because they can only replace the work of 1,000 clerks. And I think that it's a really interesting quote for its accuracy and inaccuracy. Of course, computers are used in architecture, but interestingly enough, I think that the other part of the quote is still true. They really only can replace the work of 1,000 clerks. And so one of the real problems we face as a profession is differentiating between problems that are susceptible to the work of 1,000 clerks and problems that are not. And I think a lot of the social and political realities of urban problems are not. And yet this work, I wouldn't say is, I would try to say at least that it's not kind of naive to those issues. In fact, this work is a very deliberate, what I've done with this work mostly is gone after mayors and political conversations and community groups, and the work is an attempt to show how the work of the money that we give to large single infrastructural projects that benefit a single company can be better done by dispersed projects, by dispersed spending on the surface in communities. And that's the kind of politics which I've come to it. And the pieces of the video I showed you, that videos they now show at the kind of intro meeting to all community greening projects in San Francisco, because it's changed in a small way. I'm not saying I've had a huge effect, but it has had some effect on the conversation about pavements to parks and urban greening in San Francisco, in that there was not an awareness in that discussion before that these projects do not just provide social benefit, but do provide thermodynamic benefit. And you put your finger on it when you said it's much, we can model hydrology, we can model heat islands. We can't model whether a park will be successful or not at all. What we can do is provide a structure whereby, though we can do, we did have identified in both that project and in the LA project, we do flag when, for example, there is an existing community group working in the neighborhood, because that is actually an indication that a community-oriented project in the neighborhood, one that might, for instance, have a community garden as well as just a low albedo surface or a swale or something, a low maintenance swale, you could start to differentiate. And I'm not saying computers are useless in social context. In fact, we are seeing social interactions transformed by digital mediation, and that's part of the work we're trying to do with the Berkeley Center for New Media, is imagining how social media can or might engage with this kind of process. But that's a much bigger and woollier problem than drainage, and therefore has been less part of the work, but probably in the end maybe the most important part of the work as it goes forward.
Maybe for the students, I was interested in how many times we all know
Right.
into actually a project. And I think it's this brilliance of saying that underneath the billboards, which are capitalist,
Yeah.
you find a useful thing other than the message. But
Right.
I was wondering, you probably have other ideas of how there's translations of these seemingly disconnected ideas become a kind of architectural project or an urban project. Are there others that you think are
I think, well, one of the most kind of surreal experiences I had in the course of this. So I come to this in the lecture is its problems or density and maybe disorganization of the result are the product of an architect who uses ideas and history as a tool in practice or attempts to do so. One of the really interesting things to me is like I did this work and then I started sort of chasing down some of the historical connections afterwards because I was interested in, and chasing the ghost of Matta Clark through the archive was a positively disorienting experience because first of all, I only discovered in this correspondence that he was aware of GIS, interested in it, like writing to the like 3 or 4 most important people in the country in the history of GIS in the 1970s saying, can I come and do this work? So that I was completely unoriginal there, and then I was also completely unoriginal because the more I dug into the fake estates, the more I realized that actually he never, the work as a commentary was only exhibited after his death. He was assembling the sites for a potential, as his own interests were turning from these kind of polemical artistic projects to more community-based architecture and design work, and he was interested precisely in the ability to assemble territory in the city to a kind of social political purpose versus just a kind of commentary. So I think that but I don't know, the other projects that are ongoing, we're looking at these we're looking at about 5,000, by we I just mean myself and the students working with me. I always get very disoriented when people use we in lectures because it's unclear exactly who the we is, but that's we're looking in collaboration with Jeff Mena and Nicola Twilley at Studio X in Columbia, New York. We're looking at 5,000 sites in New York, and we're also working with a guy named Eric Sanderson who did this large-scale ecological modeling of what the Manhattan ecology was in, not just the Manhattan ecology now, it's the Wailika project, which is the whole region, and we're looking at these sites as moments, not just community moment, but we're looking at things. It turns out that historical data is a really interesting way to see what the city wants now in terms of things like habitat corridors and things like that. So we're using precisely the distance between the abandoned sites now and the historical kind of continuous ecological landscape of the city as a way to kind of potentially pepper the modern city with this kind of not only a memory but also a kind of anticipation of what the ecology could become. And then most recently, I almost showed slides of this, but this project is also part of the American contribution to the Venice Architecture Biennale right now. And I was in there last week doing a workshop on the 60-odd, amazingly enough, abandoned islands of the Venetian lagoon, and looking at how Venice is this like crazy, if you try to look at it as interesting enough, so the organizers at the Institute for Urban Design initially wanted me to do a workshop based on the US data, but I had the very good fortune of having spent a semester running UVA's program in Venice, which is a joint architectural landscape project, and being somewhat familiar and saying, no, it's actually a much better example very locally, and you have this completely screwed up city, a city of 60,000 with whose only economy is tourism, 8 million bed nights a year, 25 million day trippers into a city of 60,000. So it's completely obliterated by this kind of economy. And then the ecological reality of the lagoon is also really grim. But interestingly enough, vis-a-vis this work in general, the lagoon itself is almost an entirely man-made artifact to begin with. It's only 6,000 years old ecologically and would have silted up several hundred years ago had not the Venetians done these kinds of major interventions in the ecology to allow it to continue. And so we're looking at the workshop was about using the software to look at this network of abandoned islands to be a kind of ecological network remediating the salt marsh of the lagoon, but then also a kind of potentially an economic network through things like artist residencies, to go back and kind of engagement, not a kind of idealized build out of huge constructions on each of these islands, but actually interested precisely in the kinds of marginal, potentially low cost, high economic cultural return occupations that this larger network of spaces around the lagoon could have to potentially leverage a more robust or resilient economic future for Venice as well, other than just serving as a hotel.
Are those results on the web?
I mean, this is like the site visits were last week. They will be online, so yeah.
One more question.
I'm sorry I was late because I wanted to hear more about what your perspective was on.
You didn't miss much.
No, I'm sure I did. The power and
Yeah.
potential of GIS for many aspects of it. But when I did walk in, you were talking about San Francisco and New
Yeah.
York and Venice, which are
Yeah.
all very data-rich areas from
Yeah.
a GIS standpoint.
Yeah.
Certainly in New York and San
Yeah.
Francisco, it's had decades of history, having integrated
Right.
an enterprise GIS with a rich variety of data.
Yeah.
But other places here domestically and
Yeah.
internationally do not have that.
Yeah.
Here in Syracuse, we reside in a very, very data-poor area
Right.
in terms of GIS, which compromises just revealing and understanding what's going on, much less modeling it.
Yeah.
So I'm curious if you could speak to what the impact is of that, because of your
Yeah.
work has been in these very data-rich areas.
Well, I mean, data mining is a real skill. I mean, this is what if I were to put in charge of a architectural school curriculum, this question I think of data is increasingly central, and thinking critically about data is as important as thinking critically about line weights or thinking critically about other forms of representation. I think that some of the most interesting conversations I've had since starting the work is attempting to imagine, because just like you raise, I think, a crucial point, not just for the work in this work as it might be in, say, Syracuse versus New York, but also the fact that just like most of the city that we'll build in the next 40 years isn't designed in a sense that we now know it, or won't be designed in a sense that we now know it, most of the urbanization happening in the world is not describable by data as we might conventionally understand it. There's no GIS or publicly accessible, either the GIS in places like Brazil is not publicly accessible or it just doesn't exist. And yet we can actually, some of the most interesting conversations I've had are with people like Karen Sito, for example, at Yale, who's done a lot of work on urbanization in China only using remote sensing data, that is to say, but deriving remarkable amounts of information about geometry, infrastructure, things like that from, and so that, her work is a great example about a critical use of data, working with what's there versus the experience when you're trying to teach anyone, including yourself, about how to use data, you always have the sense of I need that data set, and the one guarantee is that data set won't exist. The kind of one you imagine, and therefore it's a much more kind of historic piecing together things. I teach the kind of introduction to architectural landscape and urbanism at Berkeley, and one of the early examples I give about how we need to get we need to begin to operate is how there's a theory, at least, that all the Sherlock Holmes stories and the kind of trope of piecing together clues were directly generated by the explosion of media in the Victorian world. The easy availability of printing, newspapers, the tabloid was a word that came from Victorian times, suddenly consuming information much more richly, and therefore a hero like Sherlock Holmes, whose only thought was to kind of whose only skill was to reorder information so it became the seemingly insignificant became intelligible and kind of central. So the chirp of the bird, the creek, the bell pull, the dog that didn't bark, all these diverse kind of inputs were suddenly rendered masterfully into this linear narrative that happens like in the word for it in literary terms is retroactive continuity. In the last kind of 3 pages of a Sherlock Holmes story, everything is reordered so it suddenly is instrumental and makes sense. And I think that's the kind of skill of kind of reordering of finding upending and blocks of information so that they form a kind of continuous narrative to get you closer to what you're trying to learn.
In the spirit of encouraging student questions, would you mind just taking, if it's quick, is it a quick question?
I'd be happy to take,
Okay.
yeah.
So I see hands in the back.
So, with the invention of the intercontinental missile that you covered earlier, between 1952 to 1957, a new kind of human connection was created. At the same time, we have the end of SIAM and the emergence of Team 10, focusing on the habitat and concern to social conditions and emotions. What effect do you think inventions like the intercontinental missile had on the mindset of an emerging group like Team 10?
Oh, huge. Not directly. The kind of intellectual history is enmeshed because so systems engineering was an attempt to apply cybernetic principles to the design of large-scale technological systems, inputs and outputs. The black boxes that came out. You've heard the phrase black box. A system engineering proposal, instead of designing the airplane from one end to the other, would first decide what all the systems of the airplane would be, assign each of those a team. Those teams would only interact with each other in terms of the inputs and outputs between those different systems. So that's where the phrase black boxes came from, in these inputs and outputs. That was a system based on a kind of, those inputs and outputs were the things that controlled the system, the guidance information, the fuel, the fuel gauge, et cetera, et cetera. That was the mindset of thinking about things not in terms of objects, but in terms of inputs and outputs of controls, came directly from Norbert Wiener's theory of cybernetics, which is initially developed studying the interface between an Air Force gunner and his gun, and between this interface between man-made and natural systems. And if you look at the kind of the conferences and manifests of all the early meetings around cybernetics, you not only find people like Margaret Mead, but also Buckminster Fuller and Konstantin Doxiadis, and all of and even the Smithsons, and this notion that we could somehow use this cybernetic lens to break down the barrier between our machine systems and including the physical artifacts of the city that were increasingly machine-like, and the social and environmental life, an ecological life of the city. That was the kind of core of the optimism of the age around the possibilities for systems-based design. And especially, interestingly enough, here in the US, one of the many things that deeply confused me when I was looking into the whole spacesuit story was how we're all very familiar with all the British and European examples, from Coupe Himmelblau to Archigram to where inflatables and capsules formed a really crucial part of all this kind of space-inflected architecture, space-inflected stuff was imported almost immediately in our architectural culture. And while you have a few examples like Ant Farm in the US, mostly it wasn't that. Mostly instead it was optimism about systems. So you had people like Ezra Ehrenkrantz and the kind of systems builders, and deeply influential on projects like the Operation Breakthrough Housing proposal I showed, of how we could reinvent the kind of systems of design to better match the systems of the city, which is which I think was a really noble goal, and it was limited in its outcome not by the nobleness of the goal, but rather by, I think, a misapprehension of what the systems of the city actually were, because this is what Jane Jacobs was very deliberately speaking to in that last chapter. She wasn't operating in her own naive world. She worked for Architectural Record. She knew all what the discourse was in the design culture of the time, and she was very deliberately saying, yes, you have a system here. This is what she meant by a collection of file drawers, but it's a system that seeks to optimize, which all systems design does, try and find the best, the most perfect solution. But a city, is very precisely the opposite of a kind of optimizing system. You can't optimize a city as much as, I've gone to enter this world of like cities and information and smart cities, and I hear a lot, even today, from people who are